So let me say a few words by way of introduction. If I were to characterize Elizabeth, I would say a few things along these lines. She is a humanities major, and I think that's important to point out. In this day and age, there are living humanities majors.
Last unicorn right here.
that can be found in the landscape of life. She is therefore really an interdisciplinary person. Someone who doesn't just say she studies different disciplines, but actually works within both and combines them. She has a keen ability, it seems to me, to see living realities on the page. And that's really valuable in the humanities kind of area. So I'd say she brings together two areas, literary studies and historical studies. And I would defer to Crystal to say what she has done in literary studies, but my end of it, my experience of it, has been she has a very good feel for the context of every text and the interplay between historical context and the actual text of the artwork itself. And she has brought that into this particular study. In her historical study, it seems to me she's been very influenced by, sort of, I might say, the school of David Light and his student Brian Jordan. Some of you had Brian's course. And so here we have a real interest in the history of memory. And not necessarily the event itself, but how we remember things. And that has a history all in itself. And in particular in the era of the Civil War, one can talk a lot about how we remember it as a part of what actually happened and what it's meant for us as a nation. Still strikes me interesting, if I might have a little sidelight here. We are supposed to be in the middle of a national remembrance of the Civil War right now. Are you aware of that? It's supposed to be a 4-year, 150th anniversary. Have you heard anything on the national level?
Like one at first.
Yeah. Basically, they've said, the national organization said, you do things on a local level, and we'll give you our symbol so we can say you did a national event. No one wants to talk about it at the national level still, 150 years later. So there are issues of memory and what it means relative to what actually happened. And Elizabeth brings a great deal of that kind of thinking, that kind of sensibility, that kind of historical research to this project. The result then, in my mind, is a combination of cultural and social history. In cultural history, she does a wonderful job of bringing the literary and the historical together, in ways in which literary texts both influenced and were influenced by the context itself. Well, it's been great fun to talk about literature in the mix of this cultural history. And then, clearly, social history. For Elizabeth, and those of you who know her or have talked with her for any more than 5 minutes will know, people matter a great deal to her, and people's stories matter a great deal, and telling those stories. So this is not a cultural history that's a detached set of ideas from the people who thought them, felt them, read about them, and taught them to others. So that's what she brought to this project. I would say a couple other things in addition to her academic experience. Elizabeth is already a quite accomplished public historian. I'm sure you're aware of that as well. She is, as far as I know, the youngest I've ever met, a board member of a historical society, the Northern York County Historical and Preservation Society. Some of you, if you've driven through Main Street on Dillsburg, you've noticed the rebuilding of the Dills Tavern, for example. She's been instrumental in that. She's also written the definitive history of the tavern for the Historical Society. A great deal of research, has cataloged artifacts for the Society, directed the Colonial Day Camp for elementary school children, and even pulled off a very successful charity fundraiser. Undergraduates have done that. And I want to stress, if you've ever been in fundraising, the word successful. Of course, this last summer, most of you likely know, she was, I think the term is too diminutive, interpretive intern. I think she was a ranger out at the Gettysburg National Park on this big summer, this big commemorative summer. Peggy and I went out and visited her, and she took us on one of her public tours, and I still see her in her outfit. She's still a Ranger Liz to me forever. She did a remarkable job there. Let me just say the two tours that she put together on her own research. One was on the Soldiers National Cemetery tour, so the area you begin where the Gettysburg Address was, and then you work through the cemetery. And she talked about the meaning of all of that in a very articulate way. She also put together a tour for the Cemetery Ridge, a sunset tour, which is really quite good up on the ridge as the sun sets, and I think some real moving reflections on the aftermath of the war and the meaning of the Gettysburg battlefield. If that weren't enough, she also found time to put together kind of a living history Civil War event of nurses at the Spangler Farm and field hospital. Some of you may know where that is on the grounds. And she reminds me again, historians can be living. So I love this term, living historians. She's been an invited lecturer, and I'll give you just some examples. The Sulphur Springs Historical Society recently in New York, Springs, Pennsylvania, the Northern High School History Club, our own public history course, Jim LeGrand's course, which, by the way, he's actually teaching right now at UV, so he sent his regrets on that score. But she's spoken in his class about public history, and so she's already giving back here before she's graduated in terms of these sort of professional areas. This Saturday, she will be presenting a paper at the 8th Annual Undergraduate Conference on Medieval and Early Modern Studies at Moravian College out in Bethlehem. And she's been interviewed not once but twice by the Chambersburg Public Opinion newspaper about Gettysburg's anniversary year. I think even if you look at our faculty this year, we haven't had this much public. Good for you. And then I would say she really is a master's student. She's among the very top students in our department in terms of GPA, a Phi Alpha Theta National Honor Society member, and of course an honors project participant, very active member in the History Club, and I just think a model student in that score, a very generous person, both socially as well as intellectually. So it's been a real joy to work with her. Please come on in. This past, I guess about 8 or 9 months now. And Elizabeth, I've enjoyed our Friday afternoon conversations. There are many times we showed up both very weary at the end of the week, and boy, we were going gangbusters by the end, having a good time. So I appreciate that. I'll miss that. I think I'll leave it to Elizabeth to say the nature of her project, but I'll only leave you with this thought. There's really no way that she could cover everything she found. She'll talk a bit about what she'll leave out, but focusing on some of the original findings. And I do want to suggest there are not just original findings to her and to me, but to anybody. And I think there's some real publishable material here, which is a very exciting result. As a medievalist, I'm always interested in medievalism, the way in which modern American society would take medieval things and appropriate them for other uses. And so chivalry struck me when she proposed the idea as a wonderful way of looking at this. And so I was intellectually interested in the subject. Personally as well, I am a descendant of a Virginia plantation family, and one of my ancestors rode with Jeb Stuart. I have a picture of him with the plumed hat and really exotic. So I wanted to know more about what were these guys doing with medieval chivalry, thinking it was who they were. So we learned a lot about social indicators, gender indicators, and even legal status out of this notion of chivalry. Who would have thought? So we found a lot of interesting things. Elizabeth found a lot of interesting things. And I was more than satisfied with the results, both professionally and personally. So without further ado, let me turn these over to Elizabeth Motich.
I just turned redder and redder. I want to thank all of you here, first of all. I especially want to thank Dr. Huffman, who's been incredibly influential to me over the years as an advisor and a professor. He's very patient, sat with me through difficult times trying to puzzle out how do you interpret history? What really is historiography? How do you make sense of the memory of these things that we've encountered here? And Dr. Downing also has been incredibly influential to me in the literature department. So approaching that from that discipline, I really appreciate everyone's help and support. My mother, my father, who passed away 6 years ago, everyone means so much to me here at this school. And I may be asked during the course of this presentation, why history? You know, you were an interdisciplinary student, you could have chosen literature, you could have chosen history, and the fact of the matter is that when I was a small child, I began to kind of imbibe this spirit of history. I grew up with this taste of apple butter on my tongue and the smell of coal dust in my nose. And that's just how it emerged in my life. And history, I believe, can be a sort of spirit. And I think it's what the antebellum Southerners were attempting to sort of tap into when they spoke of the days of chivalry and when they made these medievalist romanticized constructions. Because that was mentioned in their religious texts. It came out in sermons that the age of chivalry is no more. That was a very famous quote by Edmund Burke, and that kept being repeated over and over and over in many, many sources. And in this chivalry text in the sermons, they often compared chivalry to the Holy Spirit. So clearly, this had a very important role and an important significance in their culture for good and for ill. Chivalry was used to defend the institution of slavery. It was used as a propagandistic text against the North, but it also emerged in very surprising ways within the culture. It emerged in women's narratives. Women used chivalry as a way to gain some leverage in society, some power in society. And it was used by African American former slaves. After their escapes, they wrote slave narratives, and they discussed the ways that they viewed themselves to be knights. They exercised, I believe, true chivalry. So I'll begin with just showing you what you're looking at right now is the images of the chapters of this project. It began to be about 8 chapters, and it was reduced over time. There's still more. So the 2 sections that have the little dashes in them are the sections that I could not find time to write. But in its final form, it will be over 60 pages. So it's quite an immense project. And I want to explain to you PC. Hello, PC. First thing I'm going to do when I show you the slideshow is show the poem that the title was based on. Now, I've been calling this the Lamplight of Chivalry, and actually it was the Lamp of Chivalry. So this was a poem by a wartime poet named Francis Orey Tigner. And he again speaks of this almost spiritual resonance that the people of this culture felt for the concept of chivalry. So this was an ideological construction, but again, this was something that we see they really took into their hearts and informed their characters, especially in only one generation prior to the American Civil War. This was a little bit of what inspired me to work on this project. This is a very famous quote from Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi. And Twain is suggesting that perhaps the South could have been inspired by the romantic 19th century works of Sir Walter Scott to inform their motivations for starting the Civil War, for secession. So this was a question at the center of my work. Did Scott's books cause the Civil War? How could a work of fiction have anything to do with the complex and multifaceted nature of Southern secession? Particularly after I took many courses in American history, after I took a Civil War course, I thought, oh, this is bunk. This is ridiculous. But then I began to see it show up in the culture in hundreds of sources. And I realized there's something to this. This was the methodology that I used. I used many primary sources from the digital Documenting the American South database, which is something that the University of North Carolina has blessed the field of digital history with. I found diaries, books, and sermons. I used a limited number of local newspaper accounts just due to their availability and the scope of the project. And I really tried to limit the number of post-war sources because of something that I'll tell you next slide. But I was trying to limit the number of lost cause sources, and I'll go into that on more detail. My secondary sources were many notable scholars of the American South: Bertram Wyatt Brown's Southern Honor, an author named Paul Christopher Anderson, who wrote Blood Image, which was a book about the Civil War General Turner Ashby, and Eugene and Elizabeth Genovese, and a literary historian named Richie Devon Watson, who has pretty recent works which are focused on medievalism in the South. He wrote a book called Normans and Saxons, which is about Southern race mythology prior to the Civil War. So that was a huge influence. Now, I had some very obvious limits to my scholarship. With a literary history, it is very hard to find the voices and opinions of people who were not literate. And so it was hard to narrow or to widen my scholarship to include impoverished people, to include people outside of the scope of the wealthy. And chivalry really had cultural connotations that implied an insider culture. In a lot of ways, this was used as something that promoted exclusivist, aristocratic culture. So, of course, you're not going to find a lot from the underclasses, with the exception of the slave narratives that I found, and the exception of one Civil War source from an average everyday private in the war. But my biggest limit with this project was the lost cause genre of fiction. Now, the lost cause pertains to books written after the Civil War that intentionally attempt to romanticize and make this rosy image out of pre-war life in the South. So this was obviously an issue because in a project dealing with Romanticism and a project dealing with knighthood and chivalry, where we're trying to, get at the heart of, well, what were these Civil War generals really like, and how did they actually perceive themselves, and did they actually see themselves as knights, and did average everyday people see themselves in these medievalist ways? It's going to be difficult when you're finding sources written after the war that are, affirming your scholarship, but at the same time, the lost cause isn't that viable of a scholarship option for this type of project that's focusing on the antebellum era. So I began to see this emerge in the culture of the antebellum South in the 1830s to 1850s. This was a literary import. It came definitely, Walter Scott had a big thing to do with it. So Twain's thesis was somewhat vindicated, actually. It came from other European works. And it primarily influenced the plantation-owning elite in states that I called the Upper South: Virginia, Maryland, some in North Carolina and South Carolina. But as I've said before, it had surprising effects on other populations as well. And as it was so exclusive to this tiny elite culture, you see the same names come up over and over again. One of these notable people was a Texas senator named Louis Wigfall, who had a daughter who was a very famous member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy after the war. The other one was Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks is very famous for caning the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate in 1856. There was a woman who wrote a very good account. It was post-war, whose name was Virginia Clay Clopton. Her maiden name was Tunstall, which was also a very chivalrous name in the British tradition. And she dated someone named Alexander Keith McClung, who is the single most ironically described man, I think, in the history of the world. He was a famous duelist, and he supposedly would have hobbies like going out to a cemetery and eloping. And so it's really interesting how all of these people were so subject to Romanticism themselves. But again, you really see this emerging in the 1830s to 1850s. And the way that it emerged was through young people. You see this coming up over and over again in the youth culture. In 1840, there was a Southern school book published that made mention of that Edmund Burke quote I spoke about, "The age of chivalry is no more." And so children were given this as a grammar exercise, almost like something they would chant. They would internalize these things. That same book mentioned a father having a debt of honor which had to be paid back by a duel. So you have school children reading these things, and you're thinking, this is probably the aristocratic, elite. This is probably young men, and they're being socialized into this tradition. My best example of this was the James L. Duesenberry Journal. And Duesenberry, let me see if I can get it this way. This was a young man who was writing his senior project when he was 20 years old at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And James Duesenberry thought he was a knight. He very clearly thought he was a knight. This is one of the examples of the text that he made in his personal journal. It is a transcription of Walter Scott's characters in Lady of the Lake. So he made hundreds of these such romantic, poems in his diary. But the more striking here, you probably can't read this, so I'll just translate a little bit. This is about an entry from 1841 where he is stating himself to be the good and gallant knight, Sir James, defending some young women classmates against the charge of plagiarism. The injured damsels, that good and gallant knight Sir James, would shortly appear and do his devoir in their behalf. So this is a prime example of a young man living 20 years prior to the Civil War, growing up in this culture, and exercising this belief internalized from the literature that he had read. And he is not the only one. I'll just say that. There are many of them. Another great way that this showed up in the culture was through its own natively written literature. The Swallow Barn was a book written in 1832 at the height of this chivalry craze by the author John Pendleton Kennedy. Pendleton Kennedy, he would be well known as a Lost Cause author later after the war, but this book was released twice, once in 1832 and once in 1850. And Kennedy is speaking here about his young male character, a kid just like James Duesenberry, who had returned from this expedition to South America as the most dis-quixoted cavalier that ever hung up his shield at the end of a scurvy crusade. This was satire. He was mocking existent people in his culture. He makes some really interesting references and some slightly chilling references to the plantation culture as a feudal structure with lords and serfs representing the slaves. So it's really interesting that he's translating this medievalism and attempting to apply it to his economy as well. And you see this creeping in. You start to research these things and you think, well, this is so innocent. How could this really have supported this violent culture? And then you realize, oh, right. You see it turn up in insidious ways, and you see it turn up in propagandistic ways. And the other ways that this was demonstrated in the culture was through certain rituals, tournaments, and dueling. Some of you have probably been to a Renaissance fair where you saw a jousting tournament. This is almost exactly the same. It is a romanticized thing. It has very little bearing on real jousting tournaments, as Dr. Huffman will inform you. The seat of this tournament ground, one of the major ones that comes up in accounts over and over again, was at Fauquier White Sulphur Springs in the area of modern-day Warrenton, Virginia. And this was a uniquely Southern ritual. I mean, other states, northern states, people read Walter Scott. Walter Scott was a very popular author. But as scholars such as Paul C. Anderson have noted, this didn't show up in the North. You don't see jousting tournaments here, so it had unique cultural adaptations. Except now. Yeah. And it's a frightening fact that as this was the playground of the elite, people in this culture really, it's one of these scary moments when I found out that Roger Brooke Taney, who was the Supreme Court Justice in charge of the Dred Scott ruling that ruled that African Americans were slaves and not citizens, he wrote arguments in defense of this ruling from Fauquier White Sulphur Springs. He was enjoying tournaments and balls at the time that he decided the fate of millions of African Americans. It's truly chilling how, again, this happy romanticism tends to swing back and forth between really, really dreadful, insidious things. This was one of the functions of tournaments. They were a form of moral education. This author is talking about how, they were more worthy than the midnight revels of the ballroom and other such like recreations of our silken knights and faded damsels of the cities. So these were a form of moral, I don't want to say indoctrination, but it's engaging in this aristocratic culture. The youth would go and they would engage in these healthy country pastimes. They would court people that they met at these places. They would intermingle. And this was definitely one of the functions of chivalry as a code word, was to imply moral education. That if you are chivalrous, you are doing the right thing. If you're chivalrous, you're a good and upright person, and you're behaving according to the prescriptions of your society. Another topic which comes up a lot in studies of Southern literature is dueling. Dueling, Dr. Huffman and I at first were unsure if we would include this because it has such a code of honor unto its own. It's such a compartmentalized, it's an interesting study because it has a lot of origins around the time of the American Revolution, so it's not coming out at the exact same time as this big surge of chivalry in the 1840s to 1850s. But John Lyde Wilson, who was one of the governors of South Carolina, wrote a book that formalized dueling in 1838 called The Code of Honor. And dueling really represents a lot of the elements of chivalric culture, this code of honor, violence paid back for honor, dueling between young men, which kind of informed this chivalric youth culture again. And the most interesting thing that turned up when I was writing this section was that there was a very famous duel between Louis Wigfall, who would become a Democratic fire-eater senator prior to the Civil War, and Preston Brooks, who caned Charles Sumner. And you want to guess where he got that cane and why he needed it? He needed that cane because he was injured in that duel before the war. So, this violent culture, this culture of honor, this culture of chivalry paid back, it had interesting ramifications when you think of this cycle. And the other thing that's fascinating about that is that Charles Sumner was caned over a speech which mentioned chivalry, which insulted the South's honor. And they believed that by caning him, he was trying to kind of define the fact that Sumner was not his equal. And duels would only be exchanged between equals. So that was just one of the interesting things that I found. But really the most fascinating and the most significant finding that I encountered throughout this entire project was the fact that this chivalry was used as a very important tool for personal empowerment by several well-known African Americans. One of these men you see here, you'll recognize him, he's Frederick Douglass. The other is Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson was, he was believed to be the inspiration for Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom, his life story. So chivalry showed up in these accounts just through the methodological research I did. And I was amazed to find it in this location. Because when you think what I've described before, that this was something that referred really to the aristocracy, it was something that the elite used, it didn't seem like it would show up in a group that had been disenfranchised in this way. But this was very striking. It's from Josiah Henson's memoir. And what this was really, this was a very important example of cultural subversion, of using the texts, the literature of a master class to affirm your own empowerment. And what I realized through my research was that these former slaves were practicing a true manifestation of chivalry, because this was chivalry that had been tried, whereas many of the wealthy aristocratic Southerners were talking about chivalry as sort of a parlor ritual. It was sort of a game. It was a courting ritual. It was maybe something that you would sermonize or talk about in forms of moral education. This is chivalry tested. He's talking about food. He's talking about defense of women. This is really the closest to a true medieval adaptation of chivalry that I could find. And very few people will also realize that Frederick Douglass's name was chosen from Sir Walter Scott's The Lady of the Lake. His friend, the free black citizen Nathan Johnson, had been reading The Lady of the Lake, and he chose the name Frederick Douglass for him out of this character who was a 14th century medieval figure named Black Douglas of Scotland.
Wow.
And Black Douglas was a very interesting character too, because he was someone who was able to work sort of by espionage. He was able to overwhelm a larger force, larger English army, and make raids and do really, really kind of subversive things. So for Douglas to be identifying himself, as he is in this passage, he's identifying himself with this character in history. It proves again that here is someone who has internalized these chivalric stereotypes and who has internalized this. And it's really interesting too that he's stating that if I should meet you amid the free hills of old Scotland, where Black Douglas once met his foes, you might never make a slave of me again. So here he's asserting his freedom in Scotland. And he's saying something interesting about the state of our country. It's very important to see chivalry being used in this way, because it's such a subversive thing. It is not reinforcing the current culture, it's undermining it. This is another interesting adaptation of chivalry that was pretty significant to my findings. This woman is named Belle Boyd. She is dressed in pants. This was a replication of a Confederate uniform that she wore after the war. She's one of the heroines of the Lost Cause tradition, but she's interesting because she has such an ability to, kind of travel between the gender lines in her culture. And she's invoking chivalry here. She's saying that there are those who maintain that in this world women have no right to interfere in the affairs of state, in politics, plots, and counterpoints. Others who are more chivalrous are willing to admit that women have as much right to act, speak, and think as men. So that's a very interesting use of chivalry. That is not typically how this was used in antebellum Southern culture by women, because most women used this to, in a way, affirm masculinity. They would use it in similar ways to almost how we use it today, to say, my knight in shining armor, or, I like him because he's more chivalrous, or even to say, that man is not good enough to represent Southern culture, as one wartime woman spoke. She said that if our Southern men are not chivalrous enough to win the Civil War, I would rather have us be conquered by a superior race. So it's fascinating to see this because women had very little leverage and very little agency in antebellum Southern culture. Women were very much, the white Southern women would have been placed on pedestals by society. There were a lot of documents I encountered where they were being talked about as goddesses and Arthurian maidens and all of these things. And scholars suggest that a lot of this was due to the oppressive system of the plantation economy, that women would have been, it was sort of like, let's raise these white women to this high standard to distract from the master-slave relations and what was going on negatively behind closed doors. So when they made these trumped-up speeches about female chivalry, when men made these speeches, it was often just suggesting, something romanticized and something that wasn't necessarily achieved or translated into the real culture. But again, Boyd is interesting because she is someone who is able to operate within this ritual system. She knows how this functions in her culture, and she's able to maneuver it. During the Civil War, chivalry had more limited purposes than you would suggest, you would think. Chivalry really didn't show up that often in wartime texts that I've found except in propaganda pieces. So due to really the brutality of war, the violence of the war, it did sort of fade out for a while. Really a main focus of my research was to try to discover if any of these Lost Cause books about generals that stated that they were knightly and chivalrous and just larger than life in any way had a bearing on what the generals thought about themselves. And the thing that I really found was that most generals had nothing to do with chivalry. Even if they wore plumed hats like Jeb Stuart, even if they dressed that way, I couldn't find any direct verbal oral links stating that they saw themselves as knights in the same way that a student like James Duesenberry would have. Mostly with Stonewall Jackson, he complained a lot about his kidneys. I spent about 10 hours reading the letters of Stonewall Jackson, and he talked a lot about his kidneys. So most of this, again, was Lost Cause era. But the example that I have that's really interesting is that there was one average middle-class private who wrote a book later on, and he stated that one of the generals that he encountered saw him bathing his feet in a stream and assumed he was straggling or trying to desert and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the kid said, you know, well, excuse me, sir, I'm just trying to maintain my feet. And the general let him pass and just nodded him on his way. And so he declared here that he was a knightly and courtly soldier. So this is in one way that chivalry would have translated into war, was its use as something that would involve deference. So, you know, a lower class officer respecting a higher class, a higher ranking officer. And it was used very extensively as a form of propaganda. This is just a great passage that I wanted to throw in here. This was an editor of the Richmond Examiner in May of 1863, 2 months before Gettysburg. And he's talking about some of the raids that the Confederates had had on the town of Chambersburg in Pennsylvania. And he's saying that the Confederates, when they invaded Chambersburg, were practicing the knighthood of the Middle Ages in Pennsylvania and establishing a chivalric fraternity with the Dutch civilization they had invaded. But the more important thing is at the end of this passage, while it is not for the South to fight with any mean advantage, it is time for her to abandon those polite notions of war, which she has got from the Waverley novels, and to fight with fire and sword. So he's saying that they need to avenge the crimes that have been done to Virginia and to start fighting a more masculine, a more brutal war. And he's directly refuting, you know, the sort of knightly stereotype, the generals like Stuart, who would have rode around in his plumed hat and looked really good, but in his opinion would have been a lot of stuff and nonsense.
You have to read that second paragraph, the opening part.
All right.
It's too good.
All right. Chivalry is a very noble quality, but we do not get our idea of it from the mincings of dandy preachers and parlor geldings. We do not derive our interpretation of the codes of war from sprigs dressed up in Confederate uniform of uncertain moral gender. We know that we are in a dreadful war, that we fight a base and deadly enemy. Yeah. And here are some of those dandy preachers. It's fascinating that one is able to actually chart the progression of the Civil War from its very blustery beginning to the end, to defeat, through religious doctrines. Most of the people who used chivalry in sermons were Presbyterians. That was primarily what I found. And most of the discussions of chivalry referred to humility. Especially in the beginning of the war, there was one reverend who spoke of having to bow humbly before God because we have been too chivalrous. And God will see us, God will smite us for this. So that was way early in 1861. But over time, it started to become used in forms of comfort and in forms of saying, let's pick our heads up and keep going, we're still chivalrous, because they were losing the war. And it especially came out in these lost cause texts when their generals began to die. And, you know, for instance, Stonewall Jackson's reverend by the name of R.L. Dabney wrote a very famous text and spoke of Jackson as holding this sort of spirit of chivalry, this spirit of Christ almost. So this was a very important manifestation of chivalry because it was not only used by the military, this was not just speech to the troops, it would have been speech to common people as well. But it really demonstrated how this was coming out in the culture and how it was being used for religious provocation as well. Finally, we're starting to wrap it up. The age of chivalry might be coming to an end. Or is it? The Lost Cause was really interesting because, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, this was an intention of romanticizing and fictionalizing the past. and saying how good the antebellum days were and how really there was no problem with their prior system. That's what these authors said. And as such, chivalry really only increased in terms of literary metaphors and just overall use in the culture in the years just following the war. One of those authors was Louise Wigfall Wright, whose father was the one who injured Preston Brooks in the duel. So she clearly had this in her family. This was something kind of passed down from 2 generations. But she wrote a really sad story of tournaments about one-armed knights. So these men who had suffered amputations were still fighting tournaments. They were still engaging in these sad romantic rituals as the Civil War drew to an end. So that just goes to show you that this was viewed as, as I keep saying, a code word, but also sort of a source of comfort, a source of, almost something that they used to fall back on and something that they used to kind of reassure themselves that they could get this back again. That there's always this hope that the age of chivalry will come back. And I suppose it's tied into this notion of the South rising again. So, but one of the most surprising manifestations of this in post-war literature was Charles Chesnutt's House Behind the Cedars, which was a book about biracial characters who attempted to pass into the Southern elite before the war. There was one character whose name was Rowena Walden, and Rowena is the name of the main female character in Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. But Rowena met a really tragic end, although she did succeed and she was able to pass through the very segregated society by means of being chosen as the Queen of Love and Beauty at a tournament. So it's a really fascinating statement on, kind of the emergence of a new South and how do we grapple with this past that we have and move forward into the future. And so much racial injustice is still going on in our society. So that was written around 1909. And this is my final slide here. There is a current high school by the name of Turner Ashby Senior High School. Their motto is Proud Past, Bright Future. And Turner Ashby Senior High School is very interesting because they have 2 pages on their website specifically dedicated to the history of Turner Ashby, venerating him as a real saint of the Confederacy. And this is a current school. So this continues to persist in society. Most of you here have probably at some point watched or suffered through the film Gone with the Wind, as I have over Thanksgiving break. Thanks, Mom. That was 6 hours of my life. The beginning of that film, and there are many metaphors throughout it of knighthood, the beginning of the film begins with there was a land of cavaliers where knights and ladies took their last bow. So that was 1932. It was still continuing at that point. And these stereotypes persisted into the 20th and the 21st centuries. So it's really interesting because you don't see this dissipating at all as time progresses. This is something that's been existing in their culture from the 1830s to now. And I can't really conclude, due to the limited nature of the research following the war, what the lasting impact of it was on Reconstruction and on the post-war era itself. But what I will say is that this was obviously a very nuanced, very important, and very useful term in their society. Chivalry was something that had a lot of staying power, and it was not just something that could be confined to one topic or one use. It wasn't specifically racially negative or socially negative or politically negative or positive, it had a tremendous impact on many areas of society, demonstrated by the overall breadth of sources and by what those sources said about the people in that culture and how they lived and how they felt and internalized their society.